This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about managing your mental health during times of grief. So, let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 26 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin. Thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about grief, specifically how to manage your mental health during times of grief and loss. So, let's talk. This week I'm talking about what just might be one of the most challenging topics related to mental health, and it's one that we all will experience at some point or another in our lives: grief and loss. Grief is one of the most difficult emotions to work through because it's a profound and often overwhelming sense of loss, and it can feel absolutely awful. In episode 25, I talked about how recently our beloved 17-year-old cat Pushka died following a pretty sudden illness, and how heartbroken I was, and, well, still am a few weeks later, to be perfectly honest. I'm learning to work through my grief one day at a time, and I have good days, average days, and bad days. But over time, I'm working through it and finding ways to adapt. Just like many of us are, who are finding ways to deal with grief and loss, like what we've all experienced recently with the shock of all of the impacts caused by COVID-19. And so, whether you're dealing with the loss of a loved one, or the end of a situation, the loss of your job, or perhaps feelings of confusion about what the future might hold for you, grief is painful. But it is also an important part of life, because grief shows us what is truly important. With that in mind, let's talk a bit more about what grief and loss is, and how and why it happens, and then we'll get into things that you can do to manage your mental health during times of grief and loss. Grief is intense sorrow and pain caused by some type of loss. It can be caused by many different events, such as the death of a loved one, be that either a person or a pet. It could be the end of a romantic relationship, the end of a friendship, losing your job, losing your health, a loss of control, a loss of independence, to name a few. There are lots of different reasons why we might experience grief. For example, a lot of people have recently lost their jobs or their ability to earn an income pretty much overnight when COVID-19 hit and the economy went down like the Titanic. And along with the initial shock and panic, many people are quite likely experiencing grief over the losses that they've experienced. Consider this: if your sense of identity is wrapped up in what you do, which it is for so many of us, and that's taken away overnight, what happens next? What about those who have worked hard to build their own businesses, or to tap into their unique skills to create a living for themselves, only to have it all disappear suddenly? There's a lot of loss being experienced at the moment, and for many of us, we need time to grieve and to mourn what we've lost before we can even begin to think about what to do next. I know, because I went through that with my own business, as I'm sure many of you have. Here's the thing about grief and loss. Grief is unavoidable. However, grief is proof of life. And when it comes to the loss of a loved one, grief is also proof of love. Because the reality of life is that absolutely everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Grief is an expression of loss, just as much as it is an expression of life. Because to live a truly full life, we have to accept that loss is inevitable. There's a quote by an unknown author that goes, "Grief is just love with no place to go." And I think that's a pretty good description of all of that love or energy that you want to be able to give. You want to be able to either give to an individual or to put out into the world, but it now has nowhere to go. Look, let's be honest here. If we could choose not to experience loss and grief, we probably would, especially when it comes to those that we love deeply. And that's the biggest challenge when it comes to life. Accepting that we have absolutely no control over external events or indeed anything outside of our own words and actions. Nobody is immune to loss or grief, and so it's up to each of us to find ways to work through grief that feels right to us. Everyone experiences grief in their own way. You might experience shock, disbelief, sadness, anger, confusion, guilt, anxiety, emptiness, crying, exhaustion, profound sorrow, emotional heaviness, regret, trouble concentrating, pain. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to how you might experience grief. And it's quite possible that you'll feel some or all of those emotions together at any given moment, or you might swing wildly from one to another. Grief feels awful, and I'm sorry to say that there is no fast-track way through it. Even if you try to mask your pain, for example, by throwing yourself into your work, or hitting the bottle, or looking for any distraction that you can't escape grief. Those feelings, as horrible as they might be, are there to force you to confront your loss so that you can then make sense of it. If you try to avoid it, it will very likely come back to bite you in the backside later on. Back in the late 1960s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross shared her theory of the 5 stages of grief, which I think a lot of us are very familiar with now. Those stages being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, I bring that up not to go into massive detail about it, but more to say that be aware, those are sort of, from a theory perspective, those are the main 5 things that we tend to go through. You might experience some of those or all of them, and you might experience them in no specific order. Realistically, the model is about discussing the stages of grief that we quite often go through as we work towards acceptance. Theory aside, I think probably the main 2 things to be aware of when it comes to grief are, firstly, there's no one way to deal with loss, because we all experience grief and loss differently based on the situation and our own attitudes and beliefs. And secondly, grief is quite often best described as being like a roller coaster. It's very unlikely that you'll just experience it as a straight line from beginning to end, but instead it's quite likely that you'll be up, down, and all over the place for quite a while. So it's a case of taking things one day at a time, feeling what you need to feel, and being gentle with yourself. Now, if you're interested in a straightforward overview of grief, have a read through a guide by Headspace, which is an Australian mental health organisation, which is titled Dealing with Grief and Loss and the Effects on Mental Health. And I'll include the link to that in the transcript on the website at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. It's a good overview if you're interested in that sort of thing. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about some specific things that you can do to manage your mental health during times of grief. And the first is possibly the most important, which is allow yourself to grieve. Sometimes the temptation can be to throw ourselves into something else to try to distract ourselves or get past the intense feelings of loss and sadness. However, grief is an important process because we need to work through it in order to heal and to find a way to live with this new reality. Take your time and feel what you need to feel. Further to that, if you need to cry, then cry. It can be an excellent release. If you want to cry but you can't, don't feel guilty. Sometimes the body just does what it does. If you are able to cry, let me say that there is absolutely no shame in crying, regardless of age or gender. And I am not embarrassed to admit that I bawled my eyes out several times a day for the first couple of weeks after Pushka died recently, just like I have when I've lost friends or family members in the past. You're human, you're not a robot. So if you need to cry and you are physically able to cry, then cry. I kind of mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it anyway. Be kind to yourself. And I say this one quite often because I think that we all need to be a lot kinder to ourselves. But especially when it comes to grief and loss and when there is guilt involved, which can happen even in spite of any objective evidence or knowledge. I know I keep using the recent example of my cat, and it's a highly relevant one for me. When we talk about guilt, when we had to make the choice to either put her to sleep or to let her suffer because her kidneys were failing, we knew that the only fair decision that we could have possibly made was to let her go peacefully. But that did not stop the overwhelming sense of guilt that I had to work through in the days that followed. Often when we're experiencing loss, we find ourselves second-guessing the decisions that we've made in the past, and we might ruminate over past actions. But however hard we might try, we can never change what has happened. Things are as they are, and we have to be kind to ourselves, because playing the what-if game just causes more heartache. Know that you made the best choices that you possibly could based on what you knew at the time. And unfortunately, sometimes things just don't turn out for the best. So instead of blaming yourself, forgive yourself. Now that self-forgiveness, as with many aspects of dealing with grief, can take time. And I did mention before about taking things one day at a time. I'm actually going to modify that slightly and say to take things one step at a time. It's really important just to take things at your own pace. Forget about one day at a time. Sometimes, especially in the earlier stages of bereavement, it can be more like 1 minute at a time. When you're dealing with grief and loss, your emotions are probably going to be all over the place, and that's completely normal because your mind is trying to make sense of the loss that you've experienced, and it's trying to integrate the knowledge of that loss into the way that it sees itself in the world. So take your time and know that things might change in the blink of an eye. I often talk about support, and when it comes to dealing with grief, if you need to be alone, then be alone. Just like if you need company, then find company. I do think that it's ideal to find a balance. Too much of either can be just too much, and it can make things harder for you. But again, take things at your own pace. Another suggestion for looking after your mental health during times of grief is to look after yourself and practice self-care. And that means rest, sleep, gentle physical activity, eating well. I mean, look, I'm no saint with this. After my cat died, I ate every bit of junk food that I could possibly get my hands on. So I'm sorry to say in this case, it's a case of do as I say, not as I do, but I'll get myself back on track. Anyway, do take the time for self-care and again, be gentle with yourself. If you drop the ball and you do happen to eat junk food, go easy on yourself, forgive yourself, and get yourself back on track when you are able to, both physically and emotionally. The reality is that these awful feelings won't last forever, but they're also just not going to disappear overnight. If you're looking for tips on self-care, check out episode 6 of Let's Talk About Mental Health and explore that in more detail. You can either listen to that episode or read it on letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. One of the things that I think that we don't talk about enough when it comes to grief specifically is that you have the right to make decisions that are appropriate for you based on the situation. So if it's the loss of a family member and that means taking time out so that you can work through everything that you need to work through, then do what feels right to you. If you have to make decisions that might make you feel guilty, for example, having to decide that you can't attend a funeral that's far away because of financial constraints, then let go of guilt and know that you are doing the best that you possibly can. A broader point about dealing with grief and loss is that whether it's consciously or subconsciously, your goal is to work towards acceptance. Now, as hard as it might be, especially in the early stages of bereavement, the reality is that circumstances cannot be changed. Gently remind yourself that accepting things as they are will help you to come to terms with the reality of the situation. And that's important because that helps you to find ways to move forward, one step at a time. Part of that process quite likely will involve getting some support. Now, that could mean talking to a friend or a family member. It could also mean calling a hotline. For example, a professional grief counselling service. Here in Australia, we have Griefline, and each country has their own resources. You could go see your doctor or go see a therapist or a counsellor. You do not have to go through this alone. Also, let me say that if you are experiencing intense feelings of grief for weeks and weeks on end and you're really struggling to cope, it is really important that you see someone or talk to someone because it can potentially be a sign of your mental health deteriorating, and that might require professional assistance and also intervention. Remember, it's okay to ask for help. In fact, we encourage that here at Let's Talk About Mental Health. Further to that, if you are completely unable to cope, seek immediate assistance. Either call emergency services or contact a crisis line such as Beyond Blue here in Australia. If you go over to the website at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/resources, I have crisis resources listed for Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Ireland, United States, and Canada. So again, remember you're not alone. And if you don't have a friend or a family member to help you at the moment, then there are plenty of qualified professionals who can help you, and that will allow you to start to make sense of everything. My next point is a bit more of a long-term point, and it's to understand that grief does not just eventually evaporate. Often, grief will continue for years and years, if not longer. The thing with grief is it doesn't just go away. You just learn how to adapt to it and live with the loss. Now, like I said before, if you're having trouble doing that adapting process, then that's where seeking professional support can be really important. But just don't expect that it's going to, completely disappear in 3 weeks' time or 3 months' time, because it won't. You might find that thoughts will pop into your head regularly, they'll pop in every now and then, but you will find a way to move forward without necessarily moving on, if that makes sense. I've said about moving forward a couple of times in the podcast, and moving on to me means forgetting about what has happened. Moving forward means finding a way to take those steps every single day without letting go of what's happened, without letting go of that loss, without forgetting the good memories. And that's what acceptance is about. Acceptance is about learning to integrate the loss with your celebration of the good times. But you do that at your own pace. I've had a few friends of mine reach out and after we lost Pushkar and say that even years later they find themselves missing their pets immensely. And the reality is that those that we lose, whether human or animal, are never completely gone because they're always in our hearts. It's up to us to find ways to move forward in our lives without them while still keeping their memory alive within us. Do what feels right to you as you find ways to move forward. Also, if you know someone who is grieving, show them kindness and offer support, but give them space. It's a fine line between being supportive versus being in the way. So let the person know that you understand that it's a difficult time and that they can reach out to you if they need anything, then give them some space, and perhaps check in again in a few days or a week. A nice thing to do, which is just a small and simple gesture, is to send a handwritten note or card letting them know that you're thinking of them. And it's that bit of kindness that can be greatly appreciated. Grief is part of the human experience, and we've all been through it at one time or another. So making the effort to just be there for those that you care about is the kindest thing that you can do. And also giving people space is also one of the kindest things that you can do. When it comes to grief, what it all boils down to is this. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the price of living is loss. Now that might sound morbid or be a bit confronting for some of you, but I think that when we avoid talking about the truth of life, we do ourselves a great disservice, because without loss, we might never have known love, or joy, or connection, or any of the wonderful aspects of life. Life is good and bad, light and dark, happiness and sadness. Grief forces us to really look at our priorities and to celebrate what we once had, and it makes us cherish those relationships and situations that we still have and reminds us to be grateful for them. Loss can be hard to comprehend and even harder to accept. However, you will adapt, and eventually you will find acceptance, and you'll be able to look back and remember all of the good memories, all of those times of joy and contentment and love, and it's those feelings that we need to focus on, rather than sorrow. It's true that grief is painful to experience, and it is also true that this too shall pass. However, you will always have the experience of your connection to the individual or the situation alive in your heart, and that is something to cherish, always, because it is proof of love, and it is proof of life. To finish up, let me take a moment to share a quote about this week's topic that I'd like to encourage you to reflect on and consider what it means to you. This week's quote has a few disputed sources, but the best that I can find is it appears to be by a Dr. Johnson in an 1845 publication, and I'll reference that in the transcript. You've probably seen this one attributed to pretty much every man and his dog. Anyway, the quote is, "There is a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, of unspeakable love." Let me repeat that. There is a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, of unspeakable love. Alright, so that's it for this week's episode. Next week, I'll be talking about recovery. I'll be discussing the ups and downs of the process of recovering from mental health challenges and looking at different things that you can do to manage your own long-term recovery. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK and Ireland, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest for extra daily content. I've recently changed the username to better reflect the focus on mental health and to make it easier for new people to identify what Let's Talk About Mental Health is all about. So the new username is @LTA Mental Health. That's @LTA Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.